Hey there, thanks for listening in and welcome to another Ellipsis Drive Podcast. We are ready to dive into another story from individuals, teams, companies, and technologies that transform and empower the geospatial industry. Today in the spotlight, we have JBA. My name is Rosalie van der Maas, and here with me is Dr. Mark Lawless. Mark, a warm welcome to you.
Hi, Rosalie.
Hi there. Could you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Okay, yes, I'm Mark Lawless. I'm one of the directors at JBA Consulting. And I guess you might want to know a little bit about my background. So I'm a Canadian. I was born and raised in Canada, but I now live in the UK. I came to the UK in 2000 to study for a PhD in earth science and in physical geography. And then as soon as I finished that, I joined at JBA, and that started my journey here.
Great. So fresh from college, one would say. Straight into JBA. So what
many years ago, yeah.
Yeah, well, many years ago. So tell us a little bit more about your role there.
Okay, so I suppose I have two main roles at JBA, which are relevant to this. I head up our work in the international development sector, and I also head up our innovation and AI departments. And both of those things have quite an angle towards spatial data.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine that. So about JBA, like it's clear what you're focused on there, but what's the company's mission? What is JBA looking to do or to change in the world?
Yeah, I suppose maybe I'll tell you a little bit about what we do. I mean, we're a specialist science and engineering consultancy, which is really focused on flood, weather, and climate related resilience. We're about 1,000 people now, headquartered in the UK, but we've got offices in the US, in Ireland, Romania, Singapore, and Australia. And I suppose even as a sort of specialist consultancy, the things that we do in the space of what I call resilience is quite broad. I could probably summarize it best by saying we're a bunch of pretty curious, clever, and innovative people that use all forms of computer modeling and analytics to really help to first identify, where natural hazards are spatially in the world in terms of flood, weather, and climate, and the magnitude of those, and the impacts of those on society. And then really we're about developing strategies and technologies that can help that manage these risks. So these might be physical things like designing flood defenses like dikes and reservoirs and nature-based solutions. But also, of course, there's a lot of technological things in there like early warning systems, flood forecasting, decision support tools, the things that help get people out of harm in time and help to coordinate emergency responses. And of course, we're always trying to do this, in a way that is sustainable from the perspective of the environment and social equality. So our mission really is, if you mentioned mission, is really to lead in society's pursuit of resilience to climate change. And that's kind of a flavor for the type of work that we do there.
I'd say that's a great flavor of the type of work that you do. Very nice. So who do you do this work for? Because these types of insights can be relevant from various different industries, but what is your focus on, or don't you have a focus and so tell us a little bit more about industry focus.
Yeah, we've got a wide range of sectors that we work at and clients, including government, development banks, the humanitarian sector, insurance, infrastructure, energy. Essentially, we work with anyone who faces, the challenges of flood, climate, and weather, and that's a pretty broad church these days. So yeah, quite a wide range there.
Is there, because I'm curious, as you've seen, I imagine a lot of the development of JBA over the years that you've been with the company, has there been a shift from one sector to the other, or is there a sector in which your heart truly lies? I'm curious to see whether there's been a journey there over the years.
There's definitely a bit of a journey. When we started back in the 90s, you were principally working for governments in the UK for the likes of the Environment Agency and other sort of government type agencies like that. And then as we've evolved as a business, then that's brought in, these other sectors like infrastructure and energy. And then really, I suppose, an interesting journey to this conversation is then insurance and then the development sector. So that journey is quite interesting because it's got a spatial data component to it. And I suppose our journey there started many years ago when the UK Environment Agency set us a pretty impossible challenge, which was to create a flood map for the whole of the country in like less than a year. And that was a pretty impossible thing to do at that time because the computer models that we had then were just too slow to do that really. So we had to be pretty innovative that, and we came up at that time with the world's first kind of grid-based hydraulic model, which set it up quite substantially. And then we led to developing a flood model that runs on the graphics cards of computers, like in gaming technology, and that sped things up by, like 1,000 times. So that allowed us to do that stuff for the likes of, the Environment Agency in the UK. But it made us realize then clearly that, we could do other stuff with this. We could model other countries with this. So we did that. We went out and we modeled essentially every country in the world for flood risk, and we've done that now. And originally we sort of did that for the insurance sector because, of course, they needed to have this kind of national scale information to guide the things that we were going to do, that they were doing, for instance. But then we also realized that it was a real in for us to the development banks, because the development banks who are trying to support sustainable economic growth in the developing world needed to really understand that risk component. So that was an element that got us into the development sector, which is very close to my heart, because it's a sector where we can help the people who need it the most, right? And so that's a bit of a whirlwind of how we got there.
So would it be fair to say that like the UK government kickstarted the initiative by wanting you to do something impossible? You did that, you realized you could scale that up worldwide, and noticed there was a clear ask for that type of information from the insurance sector, which tends to have deeper pockets than the development sector tends to do. But then you found a possibility of actually sort of, double dipping that, and also including the development sector in the benefits of having this type of data at their fingertips. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean that's quite fair. Obviously, the wider picture is more nuanced than that, but that's a pretty good way of describing that. That's one of the like in any company, lots of things happen that lead you down a path, or in your life, that's what happens, and that was definitely a key part of it. Absolutely.
And remind me, perhaps you mentioned, but how long was it ago that you initially started out mapping the UK for flood risk?
Well, that's going back a good 15 years now. 10, 15 years. And then the majority of our work in the development sector has probably been started about 8 or 9 years ago, and that's grown quite rapidly. So, we're now working quite extensively for the likes of the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and other types of banks such as that.
All right. And so within that section of work, how does spatial data play into that? You mentioned flood data, but what else is there that is relevant in that context?
Yeah, I mean, maybe before I answer that question, maybe I'll talk a little bit about what resilience is, because I think that will lead quite nicely to answer that question. So
That's quite true.
I mentioned that most of the work that we do now is really in this kind of resilience space. So, what is resilience? What do we mean by resilience? That's a term that's quite commonly used now, but it has about as many definitions as sustainability has. Everybody has their own kind of definition. So, like, what does a resilient society, or a resilient community, or a resilient city look like? I like to use the analogy of many eggs in many baskets. A lot of countries these days are so vulnerable to things like flooding and climate change that there's no one thing that we can do that's going to give them the level of protection they need going forward. So we have to hit the problem with lots of different solutions. So in my analogy, lots of different eggs in lots of different baskets, so that the sum of those eggs and baskets creates the protection and resilience that a community needs. And if one of those eggs breaks, then there's backup with lots of different eggs. So what are those eggs? Well, there's still remains a place for traditional ways that we've dealt with these things, like flood defenses and concrete structures and these types of things. But increasingly, we're seeing the kind of false economy of using flood defenses, at least on their own. because they can be quite damaging to the environment. They can provide a false sense of security, and frankly, they cost too much and are pretty ugly, really. So increasingly, there's a recognition that the best way to combat nature is with nature, and there's a real shift towards using nature-based solutions, which I assure you has a very spatial context to it, spatial data context. So the most obvious example might be things like a reforestation of catchments. So if you reforest the upper catchment of a catchment, that's going to slow the flow of water, right? So that's going to mean your peak water level in your river is lesser. It's going to mean your people have more time to react, and you're going to have other benefits because you've reforested the catchment. And another really good example is things like mangrove forests and regenerating mangrove forests around the world. A really healthy mangrove forest can significantly reduce the impact of storm surges, cyclones on flooding and on coastal erosion. But they also create jobs. They also create ecotourism and improve biodiversity and trap carbon and these types of things. So creating a resilience, these are some of the eggs. What are the other eggs? Well, a resilient community has these physical things, but you also back it up with technology, with early warning systems, with flood forecasting systems, that you give people the time to react. And there's a really interesting thing called disaster risk financing these days, where it's a bit like insurance policy that you put in place. And then when a storm hits or a disaster hits, a country gets payment from that insurance policy straight away, which gives them the funds to help the emergency response. That's another egg. Another egg is that really a resilient community is one where you've targeted the kind of marginalized communities, and you're supporting gender equality, and you're building capacity in country, both technical capacity and governance. So these are lots of different eggs, and when you put all these eggs together, then you're creating a resilient society. So that's kind of at the crux of what resilience is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. I indeed have my own definition of resiliency, but I'm glad to hear it. It overlaps very decently with yours. So you mentioned a little bit about how it's achieved and what type of eggs you can put into different baskets to get there. But what do you start with when you start a project like this? Like, you have a question, you have an ask. Do you travel out there? Like, do you take a flight and do you engage with these communities? Do you start out by scoping out available data of that region? Like, what does your process looks like in dealing with this? Because it's very holistic, sounds like.
Yeah, a bit of all of that. A bit of very early on. Then obviously you're trying to understand, right from the beginning, you're trying to understand what is the hazard, right? What is the hazard? What are the risks that people are facing? You're trying to understand what is the situational context there in terms of the technical and the financial capacities, and how things are being managed currently at the moment. So you're often trying to quite rapidly get up to speed on all of that, and then really getting into the country quite quickly, and also very much structuring it that you were working as one team with local companies and academics and government agencies. You're trying to really establish, a core group, which includes some international people, but really importantly, really includes, the people there who are going to drive this thing forward, and they're going to have, to create the kind of legacy that it needs. So that early stage is really about situational understanding and really about building, strong relationships. Because all of my experience is everybody passionate about it. Everybody wants to do it. International people are involved, the national people are involved, and really you've got to harness the power of that, because that's what's going to drive it forward. That's what's going to create something that gets buy-in and ultimately has the kind of legacy that you want.
Yeah, okay, I get that, and that makes sense to me. Like the situational awareness initially, I can level with that. And when we loop back to the type of data or insight that goes into this or that is generated during a project, what does that look like? Because I can imagine it's a relatively complicated landscape with various different data types that are relevant, different hazard that may be relevant, but then also the challenge of feeding that data into your own systems and in your own understandings, but also doing that for local communities and making sure that you hand over the torch basically, and make sure that everything sustainably keeps working out. Like how does that work? That part of the process.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is probably that spatial data is the foundation of it all. Really, everything about resilience has a spatial context to it, hazard part. So, understanding, the spatial magnitude, the spatial distribution and magnitude of flooding. I mentioned that we've developed flood maps for everywhere, and also typically on projects do very detailed local flood modeling, and that's very spatial, in its context. And then understanding the impacts of flood is also very spatial. So we need to, collect and have information on where people live, where is the property and where is the infrastructure, what's the land use, what's the agriculture, what are the characteristics of the property and the people. All of that is spatial. Everything about this problem is spatial. And we need spatial data on the environment. So where are forests and other natural features that we might be able to use in our defense. Topography and bathymetry, climatology, it's natural hazards, so it's spatial in its in its context there. The challenge is there are often data sparsity. It's often you know what your magic recipe is of data sources, and you won't have that, so you have to do a lot of work to try and fill in gaps and synthesize and create and all sorts of things. So there's the challenges there, but I mean, increasingly that data source is getting better and better. There are lots of freely available data, and you're trying to blend globally available data sets with locally collect data sets, and no project is ever the same. But spatial data is at the heart of it all. I don't know whether I answered your question. I think I maybe answered part of it.
Part of it, yeah. So it's clear on what goes into it. But yeah, I was sort of double clicking on the operational perspective of this, which I think it's very fair to note that you have a magical recipe of things you'd like to have, but at the end of the day, you don't. So you have to fill in a lot of gaps and go looking yourself. How do you make sure that at the end of the day, the insights on geographically embedded risks that you do have are applied effectively? How do you go from basically understanding a situation as best as you can to translating that into action with people on the ground, including yourself, for example?
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier on that it is so important that right from the beginning that we develop a really closely intertwined team of international specialists, people that are in government, academics, people that are local engineering firms, so that you can make sure that all those pieces of information that you're putting into the system, have confidence that they are fit for purpose, so that we have confidence that the answers that come out at the end of the process, again, we've got confidence in them. And we don't just have confidence in them as international experts, we have confidence in them from, all the different stakeholders, within that country. So that's a real part of it, is making sure that everybody's coming along together so that they've got confidence that the things coming out back end of it are robust. And also really making sure, again, that blend of everybody that's involved in that team is helping to shape those strategies so that we know that the benefits of them and the costs of them people are bought into, because if they aren't, then it goes nowhere, because eventually, as international experts, we eventually leave, and so it's really super important that we've that everybody's on board and in agreement, and that we've help to develop local capacity to drive those things forward. And then at a very granular level, the data is a big part of that. Collecting data and trusting the data. Having that broad team, making sure that we're validating that is one of the most important things.
So when you say like validating and trusting data, is it about is it really about like validating it on site, making sure that the data you pluck out of a database somewhere that may be freely available is correct? Or is it also about like creating buy-in to indeed trust the intel? Like you mentioned both, and I'm curious, is it more of the one or more of the other that you run into?
It's a mix. We've done everything from data transfer. So we might have done some work in Burundi, for instance, and we did a lot of work locally with a local engineering firm. So we developed a good understanding of what things are, how much they cost. And we might be working in a neighboring country where we feel like, okay, we've got enough transferable knowledge there that we can draw the information from that to that. We've also, did work in Dar es Salaam and Tanzania, where we really needed to understand some spatial information on sediment and sedimentology and erosion and these sorts of things. So, we worked with a university there and got a whole load of students who were going out and collecting data for us. So we had a really dense network of spatial information that we were able to draw conclusions from, because that was important then at that stage in the project. Some projects we do are very upstream, and it's okay to have a robust enough understanding. Some projects that we're involved with are getting much closer to them actually doing something. So therefore, the level of due diligence you need on the data differs. So it's a mix of things, and no two projects are ever the same.
That's certainly what it's sounding like. Okay, yeah, but that does paint a picture for me as to how vastly different it can be, and the type of situations you run into, but also the type of partners that you're working with. Yeah. That can also include universities in that case. So that's common.
Yeah,
so that's a common situation for you guys. Okay, interesting. Great. So as a last question, because we're coming up at time, what's ahead for you guys in 2024? Like, are there any projects you're picking up that you're very excited about, or perhaps projects that are closing down that you're satisfied with looking back? What's the next calendar year going to be for you?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a lot of great projects that are going on now that will come to a close shortly. So we've been doing these sorts of resilience projects in places like Niger and Burundi and Dar es Salaam and Haiti. And so, it's really great to see those projects come to a place where you can see that, we've got somewhere that everybody's bought into. It's a real chance of success there. So from a project basis, that's that. From a company basis, we are investing a lot at the moment in AI and machine learning. So we've launched an initiative this year called JBA. And that's all about how we've been using AI for nearly 10 years, but this is all about how we kind of really accelerate our use of AI and machine learning. And a big part of that is how we are developing technology that helps us to kind of design and optimize these resilience strategies. You can imagine all those different eggs in all those different baskets that, there's, the possible permutations and how you do that are immense. And, doing that in a spreadsheet type-based approach, you can get so far, but you can probably see how, things like AI machine learning will help us optimize and fine-tune those type of resilience strategies. So that's quite a big, important part of the year ahead.
Okay, so exciting things ahead. Though ideally, we'd have another chat like this at the end of 2024, see how this project ended up and where JBAI, and that's a great name, by the way, is taking you guys.
Great.
All right.
I'd love to do that. Yeah.
That'd be awesome. Okay, so with that, we are at time. So on behalf of our listeners, I warmly thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for that. And if you're tuning in today and you'd like to know more about JBA, then make sure to visit their website, visit their socials. We'll leave some links in the description so you can go check them out. And then for now, thanks for being here with us today. And until next one.